Today's scripture lesson comes from the book of Genesis, chapter 18, verses 1 through 10. The Lord appeared to Abraham by the oaks of Mamre, and he sat at the entrance of his tent in the heat of the day. Abraham looked up and saw 3 men standing near him. And when he saw them, he ran from the tent entrance to meet them and bowed down to the ground. Abraham said, "My Lord, if I find favor with you, do not pass by your servant. Let a little water be brought and wash your feet and rest yourselves under this tree. Let me bring a little bread that you may refresh yourselves, and after that you may pass on, since you have come to your servant." So they said, "Do as you have said." And Abraham hastened into the tent to Sarah and said, "Make ready quickly 3 measures of choice flour, knead it and make cakes." Abraham ran to the herd and took a calf, tender and good, and gave it to the servant who hastened to prepare it. Then he took curds and milk and the calf that he had prepared and set it before them. And he stood by them under the tree while they ate. And they said to Abraham, "Where is your wife, Sarah?" And he said, "There in the tent." Then one of them said, "I will surely return to you in due season, and your wife Sarah shall have a son." And Sarah was listening at the tent entrance behind him. Abraham had a very important visitor, maybe the most important visitor of his life, and yet he cuts the meeting short. When this week's scripture begins, Abraham is sitting by the oaks of Mamre when he receives a visit from God. For some context, just days before, 3 if you're counting, Abraham has been circumcised, in this case by his own hand. Thank God he didn't sneeze. Just saying. This completed the ritual that would define his descendants through millennia, even today. It was a rite of passage and is a rite of passage for Jewish sons. So now, 3 days later, as Abraham is recuperating from his DIY surgery, he is not alone. God shows up. But it's funny the way this story is told. And see if you can kind of understand what I mean here. See, typically in Scripture, a visit from God would be the most important aspect of the story. It would be at the end of the story, like a climax of divine revelation or some reception of holy wisdom. But in this chapter, God only shows up at the beginning of the passage, verse 1 of chapter 18 of Genesis. And then the story veers off in another direction when Abraham sees 3 strangers coming up the road. Who knows how long Abraham and God had been meeting, or what they said to one another? None of us do. But rather than ignoring the 3 strangers approaching his tent, Abraham instead ignores his own physical pain and his conversations with God. Instead, Abraham gets up in an effort to serve these strangers, to show them hospitality and make them feel welcome. From there, the story becomes about Abraham's kindness, and then later, the miraculous news that he will be a father again, this time with his wife. For centuries, Jewish sages have interpreted this passage to mean that compassion is more important than outwardly religious behavior. Some have added that while it might at first seem as if Abraham is showing God a discourtesy by interrupting their conversation, perhaps the exchange is an elaborate test, and the strangers themselves, maybe, just maybe, are angels. After all, it's not as if this is the last time God is going to test Abraham's faith. It's also not as if these strangers would be able to tell of their own accord that Sarah will be expecting or have given birth in a year's time. In whatever way you read this passage, it strikes me as pretty intentional that Abraham only learns he is to become a father after he has shown that he's capable of kindness without prejudice, and has prioritized the needs of others over his own needs. If you'll pardon the pun, Abraham doesn't know these three men from Adam. Yet he makes it a point of personal pride that he is able to offer kindness, shelter, food, and rest, despite being on the mend himself. Pay attention to his words. If it pleases my Lord, let your servant offer to wash your feet, to give you food, let you sit under the shade of my best tree. If all of this is a test of Abraham's readiness to be a father, then it would explain a great deal about the story. Healthy parenting, after all, is about sacrifice. It's about what the early church called, in the language of the Greeks, kenosis, or selfless love. Love that takes up all parts of yourself so that there's no room for ego, and you pour it out for others. In the story, it's not until Abraham demonstrates his capacity for kenosis that he's ready to be a father. Now, you may not remember this, but Abraham has already had one son. Just 2 chapters ago, in fact, although a lot of time has passed. Now, this son was born by way of a servant in an effort to speed up God's promise to Abraham that he would be the father of a mighty nation. The result of that child's birth, however, was disastrous, and it ended in a broken home and a disowned heir in the character of Ishmael. In that earlier story, Abraham's enthusiasm, his readiness to achieve what he believes he's entitled to, leads him right into the jaws of selfish abandon. In that moment, at the end of that story, as Abraham sends his bastard son Ishmael into the wilderness to fend for himself, not knowing if the boy or his mother will live or die, Abraham has, I think you'll agree, utterly failed as a father. And now, still smarting from his own circumcision, and already being in the middle of something with God, Abraham has all the excuse in the world to neglect the needs of these 3 strangers. But instead, something is gradually happening to Abraham. He is slowly becoming more mindful, more selfless. He's not perfect, and later chapters will give him plenty of opportunity to prove his many imperfections. But he has improved. And it's only then, once the meal is served and the guests are entertained, that Abraham learns, you're ready. You're going to be a father. Today, as we all know, is Father's Day. And on a day like today, I'd be remiss not to remember the role of fathers in my life. But there's an elephant in the room, especially on days like today, and days like Mother's Day and so on, is that for many of us, the cultural expectation of what these holidays are supposed to look like doesn't always match our reality. While some of us are blessed to have loving, wise fathers in our lives, many of us don't. Some of us, despite the best intentions of all people involved, have strained relationships with their fathers. Some have lost their fathers. And that's to say nothing of our growing understanding and celebration of families, which look nothing like the traditional nuclear family model. Imagine that. All of which combined means that on days like Father's Day, some of us, not all of us, but some, feel out of place. For instance, I know, but don't really know, my own biological father. Despite, or maybe because of, a strained relationship for more than 2 decades, he feels like a stranger to me. To be honest, I'm not sure if he were asked, he could tell you where I live, or my wife's name, or basic facts about either one of us. And this has always been the case. So as a kid growing up, I was in dire need of mentors, of guardians and parent figures, including fathers, who could fill that gap and help keep me on a straight path with a head on my shoulders. You've heard the expression, it takes a village, right? Well, it's true. So I've had many fathers in few short years. In fact, while Jesus once said to his impoverished followers, many of whom were homeless, "In my Father's house are many mansions," I'd instead say, "In my Father's house are many fathers," because I've had many, and I believe that each one was sent as a gift from God when I needed him. And while each has looked, behaved and sounded differently from the others. Each was a unique person in his own right. They've all shared one common thread, because each saw in me a scrappy kid who needed a mentor and a friend. And in every case, each acted with Abraham's sense of self-sacrifice to be there. When I was 13, one of my fathers stood almost a foot taller than me. He had broad arms, which had been shaped over many years of football. He sported a shiny bald head, and he had a penchant for red polos and plain khakis almost every day, red polos and plain khakis. Once, he took me for donuts, and he told me that his dream had always been to open a donut shop of his own, despite the fact that he was a football coach and quite successful. It's hard to describe him, in words at least, because he has this distinct blend of that athletic gruffness. You know what I'm talking about, right? The megaphone voice and the bulky frame. But it was mixed with all the playfulness of a schoolboy. It was an unlikely combination, to be sure. Once I remember when Mom forgot to pick me up after school, he swung by in his truck and told goofy dad jokes all the way home. When I was 18, one of my fathers was shorter than me. He was smaller and rounder. He had dark brown hair that was thinning a little on top. He wasn't an athlete. He loved staying inside. And I can remember how many hours we pored over the software on his computer rig. This thing was sweet. Specially designed PC, all the latest hardware. Once, after I was devastated by the end of a romantic relationship, he and I sat up well into the late evening, toying with a set of microphones and recording technology, which was a hobby I now enjoy today, and a hobby he helped inspire. In my early 20s, one of my fathers had a small condo, elegantly decorated, at which we sat at an immaculately trimmed dinner table, talking for hours about everything from ancient philosophy to his new boyfriend, a match I'd helped make based on their shared interests. He was quiet, with a soft voice and a gentle demeanor, and from him I managed to learn a great deal about table settings, etiquette, and classical music. If I have any set of refinement today, a claim my wife will probably protest, I learned it from him. And if nothing else, I can now tell you the difference between Aristotle and Aquinas. In the season leading up to my marriage, one of my fathers lived seaside, cutting a bulky figure in a lawn chair, his favorite lawn chair, a stogie in one hand, Perdomo, champagne, 10th anniversary, and nothing less, and Bob Marley on the outside speakers propped up on the back porch. One night we sat as the sun was going down, watching the sky turn from yellow to gold to burning red, and finally to night, as he shared some of the best relationship advice I've ever received. He said, "Listen to her. Whatever you do, whatever you're thinking, listen to her. It's something I wished I'd learned a lot sooner." And then he laughed, probably remembering some story which he never chose to share with me. And he went silent because Buffalo Soldier came on the radio. And when Buffalo Soldier comes on the radio, you have to be quiet. And he turned up the volume. Fathers, each one completely different, with unique values and experiences and hopes and dreams. Each sharing with me some piece of knowledge that only they could offer. While it's sometimes easy to get on the pity train, and I've done it before, mourning the wasteful absence of my own biological father, I honestly can't help but feel blessed. But my story doesn't end there, and neither does Abraham's. New life is only the beginning. It's an opportunity for Abraham to learn from the mistakes of his past and raise a son of gentleness and integrity in Isaac. And like Abraham, each of us, you and I, have an opportunity to learn from the best and, even the worst parts of the folks who have mentored us as we live into a brighter future. The way these holidays are gendered, right? Mother's Day, Father's Day. It's easy to fall into this trap of thinking that only fathers can offer certain kinds of guidance, or only mothers, for that matter. The reality is that regardless of gender, we all need teachers in our lives, teachers of integrity and compassion, love and understanding. However we understand ourselves, we owe it to each other and to the youngest among us to avoid the mistakes of the past and offer a better vision for the life ahead of us. Only then, like Abraham, can we be the parents of many nations, nations of peace and justice and freedom. The Bible is rife with fathers of all stripes, some who live up to this ideal, some who do not. We have the well-meaning but always conflicted Abraham. We have the violent but passionate King David, the puzzled but faithful Joseph, and we have, at least symbolically, this image of God as a father. Now, anyone with a strained parental relationship can relate, I'm sure, to the struggle of seeing God as a parent of any kind, especially a father. Anyone who's ever been on the receiving end of an unkind father may struggle with an image of God which is so loaded with difficult associations. And Jesus speaks to this difficulty of seeing God as a parent when he asks the rhetorical question, what loving father, when asked for bread, would give his child a stone? The generosity of God, the unconditional love of God, furthermore becomes on display in Jesus' story when he assures his followers that God, being much more consistent, much more faithful than you or I, will never fail to extend love and grace to each one of us. And like Abraham's hospitality to the strangers, which in this case was extended without prejudice or hesitation, God's grace and love is freely and generously given to all of us. To all of us. To us who work or watch or wait for change. To those of us who fear the coming days. To the disenfranchised. To those who struggle to make ends meet. To those who hold no authority or celebrity. To those whose names have no legacy yet. To those of us whose lives may seem as far from God as east is from the west. To those of us whose marriages are fraught with tension. To those of us whose jobs bring no deep satisfaction. To those who are in no position to save others because, my God, we cannot save ourselves. To all of us, this gift of a loving parent, both mother and father in God. And then, as this gift of love has been extended to each one of us, we too can be mothers and fathers and mentors and friends to others, until the whole world, a world of many nations, which we mother and father, is fit to bursting with the kind of love that ends wars and feeds the hungry and clothes the naked and weeps with the heartbroken and laughs with the joyful. It's a love that knows no boundaries of biology or a family name. It's a love for all people, a mother's love, a father's love.